Africa seems to be heading rapidly for a debt crisis across the continent. In 2020, sub-Saharan Africa had a total external debt stock of $702.4 billion compared to $380.9 billion in 2012. The amount owed to official creditors, including multilateral lenders, governments, and government agencies, increased from about $119 billion to $258 billion. The ability of countries to manage their debts is complicated by the changing composition of the debt. They now owe more money to a broader range of creditors. In addition, the amount of bonds issued by African states on international markets have tripled in the last 10 years. These bonds are held by a broad range of investors such as insurance companies, pension funds, hedge funds, investment banks, and even individuals. And the alarm bells are ringing. But is anyone really paying attention? Joining me now from Paris, France, is Martin Kessler. He's the Executive Director of Finance Development Lab, which is a think tank that recently published a paper highlighting the coming debt crisis for Africa. Martin, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.
So in terms of Africa's debts, we've seen that it has been building over the past several years. But when you look at the fact that the pandemic and then the Russia-Ukraine crisis just basically pushed a lot of African countries towards the cliff, it's more of an acceleration of what was eventually going to come. So in terms of the debt Africa has now, how has the continent, if we'll probably focus on just sub-Saharan Africa, how has it taken on so much debt? What are the numbers we're looking at here?
No, exactly, you're right. So those are long-term trends. They started after the initiative of developed countries and the bilateral lenders in the early 2000s to cancel part of the debt owed to governments and part of the debt owed to multilateral creditors such as the IMF and the World Bank. And that happened around 2005. And then since then, as you said in your introduction, the debt trends increased a lot. They were multiplied by 3 for governments. And what changed a lot is the entrance of new creditors, bond markets, bond holders, and also in bilateral creditors. It's not so much the Paris Club members, this group of G7 economies and a few others, but China that has emerged as a large creditor. So all those trends have pushed up the loans to African governments, and then that was until 2019. And then when COVID came, government revenues fell by a lot, and to compensate for that, governments needed to borrow more. And now we have the Ukraine-Russia, the Russian war in Ukraine, and that again is another crisis to deal with. And all those trends lead to higher debts, lower growth, and that's very concerning for the sustainability of government debt in Africa.
Okay, so we hear a typical narrative when it comes to African countries that we borrow too much and then the countries spend irresponsibly, maybe not on self-financing projects or not really on things that will be able to push themselves. But in your report, The Coming Debt Crisis, you found that while debt stocks remain low, it's the current cost of funding that has made debt servicing hard to basically sustain. So what's the cost of funding for African countries? Because there's also a conversation around whether or not African countries are truly treated fairly when it even comes to the rates and all the sort of dotted I's and crossed T's that have to do with all the things that they sign for this money that they borrow.
Right, exactly. So basically, you have two things. I think the question of can debt be sustained? Is debt good? It's an important one, and there's 2 elements to take into account. The first is, what do you use debt for? Debt is not necessarily bad. You can use debt for investment, for infrastructure, for your education, things that are going to bring more revenues, to bring more economic growth, human development in different countries, and that's extremely important. And if debt is used well, it will not create sustainability problems. You have another problem, which is the cost of debt. And here there has been a large shift. Yes, if you look at the ratios of debt to GDP or debt to government revenues, and you compare countries like Japan, like Italy, that's much higher, 3 times, 4 times higher than in most African countries. And so there's a question of why is it the case that we speak about debt crisis in Africa and not so much in Japan. And the reason is there's several reasons. One is that African governments have to borrow in foreign currency, and that's a major vulnerability when, as it's happening now, the US dollar is appreciating. It's harder to obtain, and so it makes reimbursing debt more expensive. And the other element is the cost of debt through the interest rates. And here, that's linked to the fact that there's been a lot more borrowing from the markets, which means more expensive. Traditionally, African governments used to borrow from the World Bank, from the IMF, from the African Development Bank, all of which lend at concessional rate. And so that makes less expensive. And now with China emerging as a major lender, China lends at not as high rates as the markets, as private creditors. It's still a policy lending, so it's less expensive, but still higher than what you had with the World Bank or with the African Development Bank. And then the markets are even more expensive terms. And so that is a real risk. That is the cost of debt. And with a more expensive debt, you get more debt service in the line that is harder to reimburse. And that's where we see the vulnerability as coming.
Okay, so we'll get to the vulnerabilities and who exactly on the continent is vulnerable. But as you mentioned, the dollar, we've seen that in terms of this strong dollar, of course, the repeated rate hikes with the U.S. Federal Reserve. It seems to every few decades we have maybe a continent or a part of a continent that has this debt conversation happening with it, particularly for the sub-Saharan African region. Is this more of a structural issue with how the debt is sourced and how it's given? You touched on the differences between the concessional lending from people like the IMF and the World Bank versus how China lends, and it goes back to sort of the changing composition of debt, particularly for the continent. So are they structural issues, and those who hold the debt, have they recognized really the harm and the vulnerabilities and the risk that they're putting on the African continent?
Yeah, no, you're completely right. So I think we've built the system in the late 1940s with the World Bank and the IMF, and it's not perfect at all. There's been a lot of crisis in emerging markets, and part of the reason is that the system is not adapted to a world where you have large bond markets, rapid capital flows, and the safety nets, the ability to help countries during crisis, and the capital flows can be very rapid. So you can have countries that used to borrow a lot and easily on markets, and from a year to the other, completely shut out. So it cannot refinance its borrowing needs. And we haven't adapted the global safety nets to that. So we have a problem with the dollar, as you mentioned. The dollar leads economic cycles everywhere in Africa, but also in Europe, in Japan. It has a very high weight on economic conjecture. And we have a problem of insufficient safety nets, and that's mainly other emerging regions have built some safety nets in one way or another by accumulating reserves, for example. Those are costly, but those protect from large financing crisis. On the African continent, we don't have this safety net, so it's a real question of how to build safety nets that are adapted to the current vulnerabilities and the rapidity of capital outflows.
Okay, so let's talk about the risk now. Your report also mentions that we're looking at countries in sub-Saharan Africa needing about $58.7 billion to service their debt loads in 2026, and that the countries crossing sustainability thresholds will rise to 18 by 2024 from 10 now. So in terms of maybe the top 5 African countries that we really need to keep an eye on in terms of being at the edge or at risk of high distress of default, who are you looking at?
So, I mean, the countries that already have a debt crisis that is ongoing, and that's already defaulted, for example. So, Zambia is a case where the country defaulted to its bondholders and to its official creditors in 2021, and had to go to the G20 common framework for debt restructuring, and agree with the IMF on a program, and is now in the process of negotiating. But you have others that I think are worrying. Ghana is in talks with the IMF and in talks with its creditors to reduce its debt. And I think what we emphasize, I would say that we're worried, but maybe less worried than others. And maybe that's something that I would like to emphasize, is that we see, as we say, in terms of stock, the debt stock are not that high. So it's really a question of how to manage the shock that is ongoing now, the shock on the dollar and the shock on interest rates. The problem is we have large refinancing needs and the cost of debt that is higher. And so what's really the problem is liquidity. It's a question of flow. And that's where those 18 countries are in trouble, that not so much that debt stock are high, but that now that they need a lot of funding, and this funding is not forthcoming. So in a way, we're not saying that those countries are insolvent. We're saying that they're illiquid, and it's very different. It means that you will have large potential growth. You will be able, if someone lends you the money, even at very high rates, at the rate that we had before the war in Ukraine, before 2022. Things there's a way to manage this crisis. The problem is that for now the lending sources don't exist.
Yes.
And so I think there's two sorts of solution. One which is to start especially for those countries that have liquidity problems, to find a way to restructure, to reschedule the debt. Instead of paying, in 2024, 2025, what you have very large amounts of debt due by African government. You could negotiate with bilateral creditors, especially China, for example, to extend the maturity. And it's something that has been done, that Kenya is trying to do on its large project loans. And I think that could manage to go over this cliff that is happening now.
So let's talk about the markets, because you did mention that, of course, and we've seen that debt investors have become a lot more risk averse. And unfortunately, that means with the situation that many African countries find themselves, they're being locked out of the international markets. Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola were the only ones since the beginning of the war in Ukraine to be able to even sell foreign bonds. And they raised $6 billion, which is the lowest amount since 2016. So what alternatives are there? These loans are already with the international bilateral institutions. They're with China already. This was an alternative source for many countries on the continent. But if they're locked out, where else do they go? We know that money is needed. Where is that money to be found, Martin?
So that's a major policy question. For now, you have a few sources, even taking into account that there won't be a lot of money from the private markets, because when interest rates rise in the US, money goes back. It's very hard to counter. So I think there's a lot of things to do still, especially from the official multilateral creditors. The World Bank, the African Development Bank are lending a lot. They've been increasing their lending the past 10 years by 2 to 3 times. But they could do more. And that's where I think there's a large process as a G20 to convince shareholders, so mostly countries in advanced economies, as well as China, the large economies, to do a lot more with those banks. So that would be an important tool to meet those financing needs. And then there's also the possibility for countries that are going to have the distress to go through the motions of debt restructuring, and those are countries that are really vulnerable. And here, the problem is also that the multilateral system does not work. You have G20 common framework for debt restructuring that is taking a long time. Zambia applied 2 years ago. It's still going through the negotiations to restructure its debt. Chad just had its agreement after 2 years, and it's very little reduction in debt service. And so that creates a lot of uncertainty. And I think one way to reduce its uncertainty would be to fix this forum and to allow debtors that are in trouble to negotiate better with their creditors. And so and then the other side is new money pouring in, and that probably right now needs to come from multilateral development banks, from official system, because the private sector is not going to lend. And that's, again, so I was saying, a place where advocacy is needed. We need to push advanced economies to to push multilateral development banks to do more. And that's that could be there's a large I think a lot of people want to see that, and that's really where we need more I think voices from everywhere to force to lead those banks to do more in on the African continent and also in the developing world in general.
So you answered my next question, which was really around the sustainability of it all and in terms of solving this issue. So what I'll ask now is, in terms of debt into 2023 and beyond, what do you think are the trends we need to watch out for? No one really could have predicted this Russia-Ukraine crisis, but we had an eye on the pandemic, and there were some projections as to how that was going to affect economies in the next 3, 4, 5 years. But as we see these rising debt figures, adding the burden of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the dollar that has been so strong with very weak African currencies this year, what do you think we should be expecting in 2023?
No, so I think that for now, what will be determinant is the choices of the American Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. They will lead a lot of the capital flow. So that's on the private side. And here, watch those banks are very uncertain. Inflation is slowing down, so there might be less increase in interest rates, which could lead capital to come back to the developing world. But it's I wouldn't bet on that. So I think there's a lot of the system to build and to strengthen. And where that can come from, I think we have a year basically. 2023, in a way, because of the structure of the debt service, is not that concerning. What was a big debt wars, big debt repayments to bondholders, especially, is 2024 and 2025. And so, if we manage to increase the role of NDBs from that, I think we can go over the major debt crisis, and then at the same time, fixing the debt restructuring system is essential. Now, what I would add is that some countries are managing even in the very rough conditions of 2022 are managing to lower their bond yields, so indicators of vulnerability. And you have in Africa countries like Morocco, like Ivory Coast, like Benin, and even Senegal, for instance, they have large debt service coming due in those next 3 years, but at the same time they've been pretty prudent fiscally, and so markets for now are asking for lower yields than they are in most other countries where you see bond yields above 10%. So I think prudent fiscal management will be also an important part on the side of African governments, but the international partners need to do a lot more at the same time.
All right, so it is something that everyone who is involved must be at the table together. Martin Kessler, Executive Director of Finance Development LAM, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge. This is the first working paper on this issue, so we know there'll be more coming out, more research and data on this, so we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the
Thank you so much. And many African countries are finding themselves between a rock and a hard place. The choice seems to be between paying off obligations or funding social projects such as health and education. Nigeria, for example, faces a $500 million payment in July, while Rwanda will need to pay $61 million on a bond maturing in May. The Ivory Coast and Gabon also face payments in December of $56 million and $37 million. The question will be, for many of us, what are the consequences if our countries fail to pay off their debts? And what could it mean for our economies and millions of African citizens? You're watching Business Edge. We're going to get into international business news and the conversation on Nigeria's rising inflation, 10th month straight in a row that it has risen, will be after the headlines. Stick around.